on this breaking news story, but President Trump relieves Secretary of State Rex Tillerson of his duties and is going to nominate CIA Director Mike Pompeo to become the new head. Excuse me, he is the head of the CIA, was the head of the CIA, wants to become Secretary of State. John Cohen, ABC News contributor, was supposed to was joining us anyway. We'll talk about what's going on in Austin. But, John, with this news story, as a former counterterrorism coordinator at the Department of Homeland Security, what are your thoughts as you hear this breaking news?
Well, while this is somewhat of an unusual way to make this type of announcement, I have to say I'm not really that surprised. I mean, for months we've been hearing that the President and the Secretary of State weren't necessarily consistent in how they were talking about foreign policy issues facing the country. There also had been rumors that the President was displeased with Rex Tillerson and hoped to replace him with Mike Pompeo. So, like I said, this is an unusual way to do it. I'm not that surprised that it has actually occurred, though.
One of the things that is most interesting and bizarre, some people will say, is that the story that Theresa May yesterday calls out Russia for, we know it's you poisoning our spies. Donald Trump has said all sorts of terrible things about everybody except for Vladimir Putin and our government. Donald Trump refuses to, even as Rex Tillerson does. So there was a rub there, and it's very confusing why Donald Trump refuses to call out Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, I think that is a very good observation on your part. The issue with Russia is extremely troubling. As someone who's been in law enforcement and national security for over 32 years, worked for Republicans and Democrats, Russia's an adversary. They've been involved in a major campaign to undermine credibility in our government, to weaken our relationship with our allies in Western Europe, to sow discord amongst our populace. They seek to weaken the United States so they can achieve their global objectives. To not come out and more strongly support our closest ally, the United Kingdom, and call out Russia in this case, while it may be a pattern of this president, it is not typical of how the United States typically behaves, and it should be troubling to everybody out there.
Yeah, all right. More throughout the day and more from ABC News on President Trump firing Rex Tillerson and going to replace him with CIA Director Mike Pompeo, assuming he is confirmed by the U.S. Senate. Well, I will still have you, John. What is going on in Austin?
Well, over the last 10 days, we've had the city's experienced 3 explosions. Bombs were left on the front porch of 3 houses. 2 of these explosions occurred yesterday. Local police believe that the same bomber or bombers are responsible for all 3. These were devices that were somewhat sophisticated in how they were constructed, and that they were designed to detonate when the package was being moved or opened. And thus far, the police have not ruled out that this is not potentially a series of hate crimes, in that the 3 victims, 2 were African American and 1 was Hispanic. So more to come on this, but it has the law enforcement authorities in Austin on edge, as well as law enforcement authorities across the country, as well as the people who live in Austin. Yeah,
you mentioned hate crime going after minorities, but, I mean, by definition, is this not terrorism?
Well, that is a very interesting question, because you have, in this case, by the actions of the bomber, an intent to create terror within that community by targeting specific people in that community. So as a local cop, as I once was, I would see this as an act of terror. Whether it fits the federal or state statutory definition of terrorism or not will greatly depend on the motivation of the attacker, whether they can prove that motivation was responsible for his conducting these attacks, and whether he had associations with a domestic or international terrorist group.
But, I mean, in a U.S. city, we have somebody who is putting off bombs, exploding bombs, causing terror in a community. I mean, that's...
Right, and that's consistent with what we've seen over the last several years, as we've spoken about in past conversations. The threat facing this country has changed, and whereas before we were primarily concerned about attacks by organizations, we now are pretty much facing exclusively the threat posed by individuals who, for either ideological or non-ideological reasons, decide to conduct targeted attacks, whether it's a mass casualty shooting or, as in this case, targeted bombings. We need to think about the threat facing our country differently than we did 5 years ago, and I'm not entirely confident that law enforcement has made that adjustment yet.
John, how many bombs have gone off in Austin?
As of this morning, 3.
3.
One around 10 days ago, and then 2 yesterday.
And then how many people have been injured by these bombs?
2 people have been killed, and a woman, a Hispanic woman, was injured yesterday.
John Cohn, ABC News correspondent, also former police officer and a counterterrorism coordinator with the Department of Homeland Security. John Cohn, thanks for your insights.